All right, so we are underway with a whole new Masechet. We are in Eiduyot, and Eiduyot technically is called testimonies from witnessing, but it's actually the testimony of earlier sages. This is considered by many scholars to be one of the oldest sections of Mishnah. It is one of the most random collections of Mishnayot. That is to say, the topics jump around from many different subjects, but it is one of the most illustrative sections of Mishnah that teaches us how we think about the law and how we think about discussions and debate. Because much of the whole first section, and many other sections as well, deals with the debate between Hillel and Shammai. Hillel and Shammai, you may know, were two of the great early sages during the Second Temple period before the destruction, and they were famous for disagreeing. They were one of the zugot, the pairs of the great leaders of their generation, and that meant that sometimes they didn't see eye to eye. And we're going to start off with a few examples of their disagreements and how the law actually was decided, or in what way. And they're going to seem like totally random topics, and they are, but the fact that these were debates between them is what's going to be important, right? So don't get too caught up in being like lost in the details of some of these topics, because they're a little, well, the fancy word is esoteric. These are not real day-to-day topics that you need to worry about for the most part, but they are topics which show you what kind of disagreements there were and how the disagreements were resolved. After the first three, then we get into some more theory about the law. So we're going to do a couple practical cases and then get into some theory. Good introduction? You'll get the hang of it as we go. But like I said, this may be a little different to start off than we're used to from our other Mishnah classes. It's why we had to sort of build up to this. All right, so we go around as readers when we don't have our designated volunteer. And Richard, are you up? Remember, anybody who doesn't feel comfortable reading in front of the group, all you have to do is say pass, and we move on to the next person. And that's perfectly fine.
Ready?
Mishnah 1.
Shammai says, for all women who begin to menstruate, suffices to reckon their purity from the time of their discovery.
All right, so first of all, notice everything in brackets is not there in the original Hebrew.
Yes, that's the
Right, because this is standard Mishnah talk, right? Standard Mishnah talk, for all women, it's enough from the time. Their time is enough. Like, what? Who? Huh? What are we talking about? And that's why this United Synagogue translation puts in brackets, so you know it's not in the original Hebrew, the words necessary to actually make sense of a sentence. This technique of writing became very, very popularized by ArtScroll when they did their translation of the Talmud, of having the translation that was of the literal words be in bold and having the interpreter's words in lighter font so that you would know what was in the text and what wasn't in the text, but you could actually read it like a paragraph rather than having to read a few words and then read a whole paragraph separate of explanation. So what are we talking about here? We are talking about the period of Nida, about the period of when a woman becomes ritually impure because of her monthly cycle. And the question here is, going to need a timeline. It seems like we do timelines a lot in this class. The question is that we have discovery, but the discovery is presumed to be after when the flow began, right? You can't discover it until after it started, but most likely you didn't discover it the instant that it started. And so the question becomes, between the discovery and the start, during this period, we're going to try a different color, right? During that period, are the things that she came into contact with unclean or not? Right? Because we know that she was having her period, but we just didn't know when it began. From the moment that it began, how much do we have to backtrack and worry about the things that happened before we discovered it, right? So very important.
We or she?
We, right? It's a
like we, the society, or she, the woman?
Yes. Right.
No, it's different because, for example, you, like if I'm a woman, okay, I can discover probably I don't have experience of that, okay, but I can discover very closer to the start, probably at the same time.
No, not always, right? Because this is a question of, the flow may have begun inside, but it hasn't exited the body yet. Right? And that's what we're talking about here. So it's already begun, but it hasn't become seen. And the question is, let's say she was cooking, right? So the food that she was handling would become ritually unclean. Now, that doesn't matter for nowadays for us, right? Because we are all ritually unclean, right? The second you step out of the mikvah, you're ritually unclean again. That's just the world we live in these days and have for a few thousand years. But if it was in the days of the temple, when Hillel and Shammai both lived, then if you had certain food, like, for example, truma, which was the food that the Kohanim would eat that was a gift to them, if they were eating that food, they had to eat it in ritual purity. So if she was ritually unclean, then the food that she cooked would be considered also ritually unclean. And now the priests can't eat it. So assuming she may be part of the priest's family. And she can't eat it either because she's also can't eat truma if she's ritually unclean. So how do we find out if she cooked something in the morning and she discovers that her flow has begun in the afternoon? Is the food that she cooked in the morning ritually unclean or not?
I thought that there's the rule is that if you are not aware of something, you are it's not your fault.
So it's definitely not a fault, right?
No, that's mean that if you start in the morning, but you are not aware until the evening,
right?
So you weren't aware of what happened in the morning, so the food is kosher. Because by the same logic.
Right up until the end, your logic is fine, right? So this is different. We've talked before about the category of mitzora, the person who has tzara'at, the skin condition that usually gets translated as leprosy, but it's not really leprosy. And one of the big things that I've tried to point out that not just the Mishnah, but so much of the Torah and the commentary about the Torah say is that if a priest examines the person, they don't become ritually unclean retroactively, right? They become ritually unclean from that moment going forward. Right? It's a very important category because that's what reminds us that tzara'at is not a physical illness, it is a spiritual problem. And that's why we don't have to worry about, infection from before. But nida, right, the woman's cycle, this is physical, right? This is not about spirituality. I mean, there are spiritual levels to it, but I mean, it's not about whether the Kohen decides she is or isn't or any sort of ritual. Her body was in the state of having menstruation in her period, or it wasn't. It actually is a physical status, right? It's just like a cow that after you slaughter it and you check inside and you see that it was dying from something, it's treif, right? It doesn't matter that it wasn't dead when you first killed it. I mean, it was dead after you killed it, but I mean, it didn't look sick, but it really was sick, and so now you can't eat it. In the same way, she didn't look like she was having her period, but we think she was having her period, or wasn't she? And what you're saying from here is actually what what Shammai is saying. Beit comes later. What Shammai is saying is that the answer to this question of is it unclean, Shammai says no, right? That if she tests, and if she does a test discovery, right, she wipes. Remember, this is in the days before tampons and maxi pads and all that stuff. They had cloth and that was it. If you test and you discover it, then, I didn't go back my other color. Shammai says now, if she cooks now, then it's unclean.
But at that period in between, it's not.
But Shammai says, right, Shammai the rabbi says that this we don't worry about. From when she tests, now we're worried. But we don't say that what she made in the morning was off limits, even though we can kind of sort of figure out that if it's visible now, then it would have been inside before, And since the Torah does talk about it from flowing from her, it does sound like it matters of whether it's in her. He says this is not an issue.
It's not the same as when someone invites you and to eat in a house, and the kitchen is not the food is something happened,
right.
It's not kosher, but you didn't see it, so you can treat as a kosher food because you didn't see it. Well, so it's the same.
If there was an accident, right? If there was an accident, or you thought it was kosher, but it turns out afterwards it wasn't kosher, yeah, that's fine, right? That's a different type of transgression.
You don't see. So if it's an accident, you really have an accident. You didn't realize. It's fine. Right.
But the difference here is that there is a knowing retroactive. We're not talking about sinfulness here, right? This is not about did you break the commandment and you're a terrible person. This is just a question of, did the things that she did, do they become unclean in the past, right? Because we do know that she physically was menstruating, and Beit Shammai says, no, we don't go back and render stuff unclean. That is not what we do. From the moment she discovers it, now and forward, things are ritually unclean until she goes, after the days, she goes to the mikveh, and then we're back to ritually clean again. But we don't worry about earlier. We just worry from discovery onward. All right, that's Shammai's opinion. Told you it would take a while to explain some of these things. Part 2. Second sentence.
Second sentence, part 1. Yeah. Hillel says, their purity is reckoned backwards from the last examination to the previous examination. It covers many days.
Okay, so Hillel has a different timeline. I'm gonna draw a different one, because otherwise they're gonna have too many squiggles. Right? Hillel says, let's imagine a woman is testing every day because she thinks that it's due. And on this test, right, she sees that there is blood. So Hillel says, what do we do about this period, right? Is it unclean or not? Now we saw Beit Shammai would say, no, as soon as she tests and discover it, we don't care about yesterday, right? We just go forward from this point. What Hillel is saying is yes, that we go all the way back to her last test and say anything from then till now is also considered to be unclean. Again, we're talking ritually unclean. There's nothing about dirtiness or anything like that. We're just talking about ritual purity questions. Hillel is in a way stricter than Shammai. Now, for those of you that are used to talking about these two guys, usually the general phrase is that Hillel is lenient and Shammai is strict. That's not always the case, and we're going to see a few examples now where that logic doesn't really work, because the words strict and lenient, those are not really easy opposites. It's not like hot and cold, up and down. So he may be strict on this, but that doesn't necessarily mean that he's being strict. He just thinks this is the correct interpretation. Now, I said if she was testing every day, but even if she was testing once a week, that would mean you'd have to go all the way back like till a week ago, when she made that casserole. That casserole becomes ritually unclean.
And she never tested before?
Then what kind of woman is she?
Latin woman, I have no idea.
Right. So
no, but what happened, for example, if the first test is the test that she did is when she discovered what she will go 1 month ago.
So that's why the testing happened more frequently. And as we're going to see, both Shammai and Hillel lose.
Really?
Yep, they both lose. So let's get to the sage's opinion, and then we'll try to reconcile all of these. And I'll do my best to try and draw these.
But the sages said, neither according to the opinion of this one or according to this one, but they are considered impure for the past 24 hours when this lesson was the period from the last examination to the previous examination, and for the period from the last examination to the previous examination. This lesson is the past 24 hours. All
right, so the short way of putting this in modern English is you are impure from your last test or the last day, whichever is shorter. So if you're testing every hour, and 1 hour you're pure and the next hour you're not, then the last hour is considered impure. And if you're testing every day, and then it lines up. But if you're testing every other day, then you're only impure for the last 24 hours, right? So they add, really wish I had a different color. They add a portion of the past, right? Which is 24 hours or last test, whichever one is the least. Right? So if you do a test 1 minute and then the next test the next minute, and now you see it, there's only 1 extra minute of uncleanliness that goes into the past. And the maximum you can put into the past is 24 hours. Right? So this is, you could say, a compromise between these two positions.
So you cannot do like 1 week, 1 month.
No. Right? According to the Chachamim, the maximum retroactive that we can add is 24 hours. Right? And that is stricter than Shammai's opinion on this, because they are adding time from the past, but it is much more lenient than Hillel, because Hillel could have like a week or more because the person wasn't testing. I mean, I should point out that the rabbis generally felt that the law that they were discussing was being observed by families that were interested in observing the law. They had a whole category called Am Haaretz, the what's that?
The simple.
What's that?
The mob.
The unwashed proletariat, the mob, the ignorant. It wasn't that they were stupid. It was the people who didn't care about law, who didn't care about well, in their opinion, they didn't care about Torah. And they didn't bother following all of the rules. They only maybe did some, or they did it not quite perfectly. And so they were really talking more about the people who cared about the law. So the idea, to not go back to your other point, Natan, of somebody who in their family, she wouldn't have tested for like a month, that just, no, they can't imagine an actual observant person who wouldn't have checked within that month. Now, there's going to be one more wrinkle. Yeah, go ahead.
So in that situation, since it's going to be 24 hours.
Maximum.
If she cooked during that last 24 hours and the priest ate it, do they have to go to the mikveh?
They would have to go to a mikveh, because the ritual impurity would be transmitted, would be carried over at that time, and that's one of the important things, is that you need to know the ripple effect that goes backwards, and they would have to sort of retrace the last day's worth of activities maximum to figure this out.
I would have men in the picture.
If they eat like, if the priest eat like Olin, and she declared impure, it's not a problem, right?
So if he's not eating food that needs to be ritually pure, then it's not a problem, but because he needs to do his job, he needs to be ritually pure. He can't go to the temple if he's ritually impure. Then he is still going to need to know that.
When he's gonna eat like teruah,
he definitely has to be, exactly.
That she's clean.
Yes. But as you can see, sometimes he might have thought she was clean. You know, she tested and it was fine, and then it turned out she wasn't. And that gap can be where the question is. But again, this is not, like you were saying, this is not like a deliberate sin. This is an accident, and sometimes it happens. You know, the human body, it's kind of weird, and you can't always predict it. But sometimes you can. So we're going to move on to number 2 in Mishnah 1.
Number 2, any woman who has a regular period, it suffices to reckon her purity with a set time.
All right, so there are some women whose zman, their time, is like clockwork, right? Every month it's the same number of days. You know, nowadays you can get an app that will help you track your period. And, you know, if you are regular, it will predict when your next period will happen.
But by the day, not by the hour.
By the day, not the hour.
If it's a few hours, you miss a few hours
so
from the test to the start.
If you are regular in your period, then you start taking precautions when your period is about to happen, right? And the Talmud goes into more detail of the different signs of the period's onset, of the headaches and other things that can happen.
Or stop cooking.
Well,
Which kind of?
Stop cooking things that might be eaten by somebody who needs to be ritually pure. Yes, right? There are precautions. The big one, of course, would be if it's your day or the time for your period, you would check before having intercourse, before you are intimate with your husband. Because if you think you're close, you would check just in case you haven't seen it yet, but it could be there. And that was done with a cloth and other procedures. So you would be cautious. And the idea would be that here, for a woman, if it's her time, right? I don't want to make another timeline, right? If it is her, I'm going to erase this. We're moving to month mode. Time. Right, this is her normal period beginning, right? The normal, whether she's 27 days, 28 days, 29, whatever she might be, this is her normal cycle. Then when she discovers it, we don't have to go in the back at all, right? We just assume that when she discovers it was the beginning, because that's the normal time for her to discover it. So in some ways, this is just like Shammai, that from the discovery onward, except it's only in the case of a woman who has a regular period that can predict it. If her period is sometimes 25 days and sometimes 30 days, then no, we don't just go with her discovery, because it could have been any time, right? Maybe it was a day ago and she didn't notice because it's so weird. And that's not so weird. It's actually normal for women to have a variable period. But for some women, they are clockwork, some women aren't. And if you know your clockwork, then your discovery is your beginning and we're good. If you know you're not like clockwork, then we do the little padding of 24 hours or your most recent test, whichever is less.
In that situation in the past, Rabbi, do they have like a lot of men cooking in the temple
Well, in the temple itself, yes, of course,
okay.
Right? But they didn't only eat truma in the temple grounds.
Okay.
Sacrifices were usually eaten on the temple grounds, not always. More complicated stuff, but the truma was not always. So yeah.
But there was ways to protect.
Always, yeah. There's nothing wrong with men cooking.
Especially in the temple barbecue.
Especially in the temple barbecue. All right, part 3.
So she who uses testing cloths, she has sexual. Behold, this is like an examination. It lessens either the period of the past 24 hours or the period from the last examination to the previous examination.
Right. So if she is regular in using these cloths, which is the recommended procedure, so that she actually checks, and she checks before they have sex, and she checks after they have sex, because sometimes intercourse can trigger the beginning of the cycle, then that's fine. And then if she checks before and then she checks after, we assume that it began immediately upon her discovery, not while they were in the middle, if you will. So we don't retroactively make him unclean for sleeping with a woman who was in the middle of her nida. We assume it happened right after they finished. Because, I'm sorry, we assume that it happened right before her last test. So yes, he is ritually unclean. Sorry. Sometimes late and too many timelines in my head. No. So because she tested right before they began, as soon as she tests after they finish, if it turns out that she is now, then we do add back until her previous test, which is right before they started. So he is considered to have been, again, by accident. So it's not like he is deliberately doing this. Is not karet.
But he's unclear.
Right. He is ritually impure. Yeah. So complicated? No. Yes. But it works out. And this is just a taste of the arguments that Shammai and Hillel have. Right? And again, these are arguments between Shammai and Hillel, the people. We will meet, probably not tonight, but we will meet eventually Shammai and Hillel's academies, the school of disciples that come after them. Okay, let's move to Eiduyot 1-2, chapter 1, Mishnah 2. And Natan, I believe it's your turn.
Shammai says from a cup for Hannah, but Hillel says from 2 cups. Okay,
that's all clear, right? Again, shorthand. All right, so I looking around the room, I think most of you have probably heard of the mitzvah of taking challah, right? Now, challah we usually use as just sort of a general word for the bread that we have on Shabbat. But that's kind of a second definition of challah. The primary definition of challah was the portion of dough that you took before you baked that was given as a gift to the Kohanim, to the priests. We have one right over here. So
bring it to you.
Exactly. So the question is, though, how much do you actually have to be baking in order for the portion that you take to have to be required and therefore use the blessing, the Asher Kiddishanu blessing. And that's what they're trying to answer. So I'll let you put your mind at rest for most of us, unless you are a commercial baker, right? Unless you are making a lot of dough, as we're going to see, you still have to take a pinch, but you do not need to say the blessing. In fact, you shouldn't say the blessing, because to say the blessing on a non-required taking of challah is a bracha levatala. It's what we call a wasted blessing. And this is one of the cases where we're going to see that one side being lenient is actually being stringent on a different topic, and one side being stringent is actually being lenient on the other topic. But let's go ahead and look at their measures. So Shammai says a dough from a kav or more is subject to the law of challah, which means if you are making a kav of dough or more, and kav, they mean the measure of flour, which I'm trying to remember, it's about 2 liters, I think. They say 1.5 liters. So there's different interpretations of how much the measure of a kav was. But
in my book it says 2 liters.
Yeah. So like I said, 2 liters, 1.5 liters. So you know those 2-liter bottles of soda?
Yeah.
Right? Or water, maybe, if you're healthy. Fill one of those up with flour, not with dough, with flour. Okay? That's, according to Shammai, the minimum you need to be baking at one batch. Doesn't mean you have to bake 1 loaf. That's that enormous. But you need to be mixing that much to be making in order to then to have to not to take, but to say the bracha.
Oh, to say the
right?
bracha.
For this to actually be a mitzvah, and therefore you have to actually say the bracha. So that means he has a smaller amount needed than Hillel. Hillel says twice that much, right? You have to be making something that is like 2 bottles of soda worth of flour. Which, if you think, those little bags of flour, and you're actually like going to be making with 4 of those or something. Again, most of us were not commercial cookers, and we don't do that. In the ancient world, that was their main food, right? They didn't have meat, and they didn't have potatoes, and they didn't have all the other stuff that we put on our plates. And you'd be making one big batch, and you'd be letting the dough rise, and then you'd be baking it all day, and that would be your breakfast, and that would be your lunch, and that would be your dinner. So it was normal to make that amount in the ancient world. I'm trying to see whether this explains it, because the Talmud goes into it. So I'm going to give you the shorthand version, but I highly recommend if you want to look up rabbinic math and how they did their measures. What they're trying to work out is that the amount that's needed should be a beitzah, which is an egg. And an egg is approximately 1/24th of a kav. And they felt that a 24th amount, to make an egg, an egg would be 24 times the amount pulled. So that's the amount that should be the measure. So they end up with a kav being needed so that when you pull, you take an egg's worth. Whereas Hillel argues that no, the amount that you're pulling from has to be larger in order to get to that, because you should be 1/48th, and that's why he ends up with a double measure. And then the sages are going to have a different measure of how they get to their size. But these are all based on their complicated math. And since it's all in these weird base 24 systems, it's just, ugh.
So the sages didn't come from the schools of Shammai and Hillel?
That's the question.
Yeah, because they are contradicting the same schools, like they're the same teachers.
Well, but Hillel and Shammai also learned from the same teachers. Wait a minute. Does that mean that not everything that was taught from the previous generation was remembered by the next generation correctly? Dun, dun, dun. Yes, that's exactly the point. Now, on the plus side, they're only arguing about 3 things, right? And what they're arguing about is not, can we murder or not murder? These are not major disagreements. I mean, this is a difference of, like a few days worth of ritual impurity, and the difference of how much you have to be baking. But yeah, this shows that they got everything clear from their teachers except this. What's going to get more complicated is when we get to Beit Hillel and Beit Shammai, who argue about a lot more than 3 things. And that is going to become a bigger issue. And that's kind of how Eiduyot is starting. It's starting off with these 3 disagreements, and then it's going to bring us into the question of, why are we talking about disagreements? And that's going to come in just a couple Mishnayot. So you are right on track for where Eiduyot wants you to be discussing. We just need to finish with the baking. But notice again, to come back to our question of what does strict and what does lenient mean, Shammai is strict on you need to do this from a smaller measure. You need to do the mitzvah to give to the Kohanim, and that means you have to do it from a smaller measure. But that means he's lenient about bracha levatala, right? About risking saying a blessing that isn't actually needed. Hillel is the opposite. Right? He is willing to be lenient on how much you can bake without having to do this as a mitzvah. But he's being very strict on, I don't want to force people to say a blessing that would be wasted, because I'm really worried about protecting the blessing from being said incorrectly and taking God's name in vain. So they're both being strict and they're both being lenient. And there's no way for someone to be strict on both things at the same time. Right? You can't just say, I'm just going to be strict. As soon as you want to be strict on one of these opinions, you're going to be lenient on the opposite point of what they're discussing.
Yeah, because there are consequences of your original position.
Exactly. And the consequences that make this strict, make that lenient. And if you make that strict, you make that lenient. It's like a seesaw. You can't push down on both sides at the same time. This just doesn't work. And also, you can't be lenient on both sides at the same time. You instead have to try and, I don't know, figure out what's actually right, rather than just saying strict is always better, lenient is always better. That's just not the way it works. And this is just a very good example, even if it's rather a uncommon subject for us to be worrying about. All right, sages, please solve the problem for us.
The sage says, neither according to the opinion of the one nor of the other, but a cup and a half requires challah.
All right, so they come up with a different measure, which, again, I'm not going to go into the mathematics of, but you can look it up for yourselves and say 1.5 is actually the measure, although it shouldn't surprise us that their answer happens to, again, be a compromise. It does happen to be a little bit of this and a little bit of that. And that does seem to be the tendency that we're seeing here. All right, now we get a very interesting historical blip.
And when they increase the measure, they say...
Okay, before we get on, because that sentence makes no sense in modern English, it means that at a certain time, what used to be called a kav was increased. And now a new kav is bigger than the old kav. Right? Yeah. It's called inflation. Right? And so they changed the way they measure. I mean, the kav is an arbitrary number. It's just like in English, a pound or a kilogram. Right? It's just a number that someone picked out of the air that said, this is a good weight, let's use this. And in fact, kilo just got changed. I mean, down at the far decimal points, but they updated what a kilo is just recently, about like a week or two ago. And they updated what their measures were as well in the ancient world. And they wanted to say that even though the number has changed, the size of the scoop has changed, the actual amount of flour hasn't changed. And so they had to adjust what they were saying so that you brought the same amount of flour, not just the same number of flour. Does that make sense? Right? Because if you change the size of the scoop and you think I need to bring 1 scoop, then your actual amount of flour in the scoop is going to be wrong. Yes? Yes. So what did they do? They said
5/4 require each.
Right? So they said it used to be, that you had to bring 1, which is equal to 4/4. But since we've now increased the size of the 1, right, you now have to bring 5/4, or as we might say, 1 1/4. Right? 1 1/4 becomes the new measure, rather than 1.5, because the total amount is larger. So therefore, the amount you have to worry about is less as a number, but it's the exact same amount of actual flour. And I'll leave it to the math major to work out what X was, how many grams of flour we're talking about here. But that's for people who enjoy math more than me. All right, and Rabbi Yossi pipes up.
5 are exempt, 5 are more required.
He said 5/4, if it was exactly 1.25, then no, you still don't have to say the blessing, and it's not required. It's not a mitzvah. But 1.26, now you do. So his argument was just on the edge. It's not. It's on the edge plus a little bit. And he loses in the argument, but that was Rabbi Yosef's opinion. In case you get tired of me saying, and he loses, we are going to talk about why we have minority opinions in just a little bit.
That's interesting, because I always thought that Hillel is pretty much one, but it's just interesting how that's not the case.
They both lost. They both lost. And that continues in Mishnah 3. And I believe it's your turn to read.
Hillel says a hin full of drawn water renders the mikvah unfit.
Okay, it's mikvah time. How do you make a mikvah? So to make a mikvah, you need mayim chayim, right, which is called living waters, which means the water has to come flowing into the mikvah from a natural source. You can't just take a bucket and go to the river, walk over to the mikvah and dump it in. The mikvah doesn't work. However, once the mikvah has been filled, and you've actually got the minimum amount of a mikvah, which is called 40 seah, then if you dump a bucket of water in, the mikvah is fine, right? Because once a mikvah is kosher, nothing can make it unkosher except draining it to the bottom. And that's very important because, well, otherwise, you'd have problems with oceans. And then how do we make the ocean kosher again? So there is one issue in between, though, which is what if I've begun my mikvah the proper way, and then a little extra water goes in from a bucket, right? Someone's walking by carrying a bucket and it spills into the mikvah that it's being filled from the natural source. Is the mikvah valid or is the mikvah not valid, right? Does one drop make it invalid or do you need a lot? The argument from Hillel here is that a hin of full water would make the mikvah unfit. And for them, they're saying that a hin is about 4.5 liters. Right, so 2 and a bit of those big soda bottles. Right, so you got a good sized bucket and you spill that in, then the whole mikvah, drain it, dry it, start over again. Right? The mikvah is not going to be kosher because it wasn't from mayim chayim, it wasn't from living waters. You have invalidated. Now there are halachic reasons of why he picks that number. It has to do with how much water is used in other places, and all of these measures have other scriptural backing. But that's not why we're here tonight, because then it gets much, much longer. All right, onward. Shammai's opinion.
However, men must speak in the language of his teacher. And Shammai says 9
kabin. All right, so he says 9 kabin. Now, a hin is equal to 3 kav, right? So if you say it takes, I want to make sure I got my math right, a full hin, right? That means you've got 3. Whereas Shammai says it takes 9 kabin, then that means Shammai is saying, well, is he stricter or more lenient, right? We'll convert them both to kav, right? So 1 hin is equal to 3 kav. And he says it's 9 kav, right? That's Hillel and that's Shammai. So which one is stricter? On what?
How easy become to be tameh.
Well, not tameh.
Not tameh,
but but pasul, right? It's not fit to be used as a mikvah, right? It's just water, right? So the amount is lower, makes it much easier to transgress. So maybe that's more lenient. Why is it stricter to ruin it more easily?
Because you build something that you want to be poor in the future. So if you want that to become as difficult as possible to become not fit.
So it's if you want it to work, then you don't want anything. Then the easier it is to make it unfit, then the stricter you're being to try and make sure that it can be built. I think I get what you're trying to say. Does that sound about right? Yeah, but no, it's not. We tend to think that we just know what strict and lenient means, but the fact that we always say Hillel is strict or lenient and Shammai is always strict, as we've seen from these three, there's usually a different way to look at each of them. that don't always line up with strict and lenient so easily.
So if I want to build something, and I want that will be more difficult to destroy it, I will make that
Or what?
more water. No, actually, less water.
Okay, so what we're really talking about.
I want to be more difficult.
Yeah.
Less water.
All right, let's see if I can put this into a different phrase, and you can see
Yes, yeah, it's more strict.
if you put a significant amount of water in the mikveh
Because
is
Shammai, you don't want to make this
pasul.
pasul.
It's pasul, right? Pasul means not fit,
Yeah.
right? It's not usable for mikveh purposes. You can't use it for what you want a mikveh to be. Okay, so what's happening here is Hillel is focused on this, right? On the fitness of the mikveh. And so for him, right, small water, he's being strict, right? If it's just a little bit of water, not so little, 4 liters is not like raindrops. Well, raindrops are okay for a mikveh, but I mean, 4 liters is not like I drop my water bottle into it. That's not an issue.
It's much easier to make this pasul.
Because he wants to make sure that the least amount of significant water that could fall into the mikveh doesn't happen, because he wants to make sure the mikveh has the maximum amount of water from the legitimate source. Okay? Shammai, however, Shammai is strict about, what do you mean significant? How can you call 4 liters significant? Right? That's not enough water to be called significant. So you may be thinking you're strict about the mikveh, but I'm going to be strict on what we count as water that is of meaningful quantity. Because in other times, in particular, when a man has had a different type of emission and needs to wash in a different way that doesn't need a mikveh, we need more water to render him fit. Therefore, if you say this small amount of water is significant for the mikveh, then I might think that small amount of water is okay for other things. But I don't think it is fit for other things. Therefore, it must be that only a larger amount of water is really a problem for the mikveh. Right? Again, if you push down on one side, you make something else more lenient. Push down on that side, you make this more lenient, right? We use water for lots of different things in Judaism. If you make the amount of water too little here in order to protect the mikveh, then you're actually reducing the amount of water we need for other mitzvahs. And again, if you make the amount of water we need for other mitzvahs, then you're making it so that a ton of water can fall in the mikveh and it's not considered ruined. And that you can't do both at the same time, right? You can't say we need a ton of significant water here and we don't need a ton of significant water here, because significant should be significant in multiple cases. See how that can get into confusion of trying to be, I'm always strict? And so they're fighting with each other over different parts of the sentence, and that leads to the different answers. Make sense? Yes? And yes, it's confusing that they're arguing because we don't want them to argue. We just want an answer. But thankfully, the sages will help us.
But the sages say neither according to the opinion of this one nor according to the opinion of this one. But when 2 weavers from the dung gate, which is in Jerusalem, came and testified in the name of Shammai and Abielon, 3 logs of drawn water render the mikveh unfit. The sages confirm their statement.
Okay, 3 logs is equal to a quarter hin.
You say logs?
Log, yeah.
Okay.
Not log like, tree trunk log, but a log. That is a quarter hin, which is actually less than Hillel. So this is the strictest interpretation if we're talking about minimum amount of water, right? It's the lenient interpretation about what we call significant. So the sages end up with a non-compromise position in this one, but end up with a stricter position for when dealing with the quantity of water. And they get there by the testimony of two guys who are totally out of nowhere. It's like here we have Hillel and Shammai, the greats, and they're remembering what their teachers told us. And all of a sudden you got two guys who are weavers, which was considered like a low respect job. And they're from the Dung Gate, which is like the low respect place in Jerusalem. And they say, well, you know, right, Shemaiah and Avtalion, they said 3 log. They win. Right? Those were the teachers, by the way, of Hillel and Shammai. Right? That pair. Those were the two guys who came before Hillel and Shammai. So we've got 2 witnesses who agree that it was 3 log, and therefore the sages go with their tradition. Hillel says one thing, Shammai says another thing. If they agreed, it wouldn't be an issue. And remember, they do agree about almost everything else. But here, they're each only one witness. We've got 2 other witnesses, and their 2 witnesses, even though they are from less respectable backgrounds and not considered to be great sages, their double testimony is considered greater proof than the single remembrance of each of these great rabbis. It's just bam. That is why we want to make sure we have a correct and protected chain of transmission. And 2 guys that come as a witness trump 1 great rabbi, especially when the 2 guys are witnesses to the guys that taught these 2 guys and who now they can't agree amongst themselves. Interesting point about these.
How do you know that they remember correctly?
Because they agree. 2 witnesses. When 2 witnesses say that they saw the moon, how do you know they're right? Because you have 2 witnesses. When 2 witnesses say that, yes, those 2 people got married, we were there for the wedding, how do we know? There were 2 witnesses. The Torah tells us that 2 witnesses are proof. As soon as you start questioning, you know, the witnesses, then everything falls apart. Right? We are only as good as our testimony, which is why Eiduyot is the name of this particular Masechet. It is about testimony. And it's just great, though, to have these great rabbis, and we're going to have lots of other great rabbis' comments as well later on, all these great rabbis, and then here come these 2 guys. And it's like, yeah, we remember something. If you remember something, you are a gift, right? That is, you are a treasure, especially in the days before books. But even now, books can sometimes be wrong. But if you remember something, thank God you studied. Even if the only thing you remember is this, right? The 2 of you together, that is enough for us to recover what had been taught to these 2 other guys that can't agree of what we're supposed to be, right? This is why, by the way, you don't need to be a great rabbi to be important in the Jewish world, right? All you need to be is someone who has studied at least a little. You study at least a little, and some part of Judaism lives in you. And you are now the keeper of that. You are the guardian of that tradition, that piece of information. And if it's needed, you'll be ready to provide it. That's one of the great things in Judaism, and it's very democratic, small d democratic. Remember, they didn't have Democrats and Republicans 2,000 years ago. Not making a party affiliation, right? But it's very. I don't care if you are from the lowest of the low. If you remember, then please share your remembrance so that it is part of our tradition.
That kind of makes you think about that when you are Jewish, everyone is valuable. Yes, there's certain things that, some people are like not, well,
some people are better at than others, yeah.
But it's still the fact that, everyone is valuable. I mean, when you're working as a team and you're a good manager, you don't take for granted anything that comes out of anyone's mouth because you want to see what the best options will be. And
correct.
So it's nice to see that in the Jewish culture, to be able to experience it and understand. It doesn't matter if it's, just an usher, or if it's, a greeter.
Right.
They all bring in beauty into,
and that's been there from the beginning. Yeah. Right. That's not some new modern, wishy-washy Enlightenment idea. That's core Judaism. One little aside, and then, one little aside. which is, why did Hillel say that a man must speak in the language of his teachers? There's a couple different explanations for that. So one of them is just the idea that he had to quote his teachers, meaning that that was what you did. The other is that his two teachers, Shammai's as well, they were both converts, and they weren't able to pronounce the hey correctly. So when they went to say hin, they said in. It's much like certain English accents, with, there were hurricanes in Hereford hardly ever happen, the My Fair Lady speech thing. Right? There's many English accents where they drop off the H's. And apparently these two guys who were, great sages, they were converts. And their Hebrew pronunciation wasn't perfect. They didn't make their hays very strong. And so Hillel was actually repeating what they said in their accent in order to say, this is what they taught me. Again, it still turns out that he was remembering wrong. But it's just an idea that when you repeat what you were taught, you can go up to and including, really trying to capture precisely what you were taught in order to hold on to it.
I still have a problem with Ashkenazi when they say Eiduyot. Like, okay, it's Adonai.
Like with Torah. Yeah, Torah.
Torah.
The mitzvahs.
Yeah, there's just certain
mitzvot. But to be fair, the different pronunciation traditions of contemporary Judaism each have good pedigrees, right? There's a reason, and there are good reasons why the Ashkenazim had those types of pronunciations, and a good reason why the Sephardim had different pronunciations. And there's also political and cultural reasons why the modern state of Israel chose mostly the Sephardic pronunciation for the modern language. Well, there are good arguments of which one is more correct. But if you really wanted to be a stickler for who is most likely to have preserved best the full nuances of Hebrew pronunciation for the longest period of time, it's the Yemenite Jews. Right, the Yemenites. They are the ones who most likely have preserved the most. But even
no one can with the ayin like that.
Oh, of course, you can actually hear the difference between an ayin and an aleph, right? It just very, very easily. Yeah, but that's because they also lived among an Arabic-speaking culture that also has the difference between the same ayin sound and the aleph sound in Arabic. So, it's natural that they preserve that. But if you lived anywhere else, like Europe, no one around you was doing that. So why would you do that? So language is always funny, and pronunciation is very tricky, which is why it's great that we have so many different accents just in this one room, but we can still study together. All right. Speaking of studying together, I want to just hit Mishnah 1:4 because it is it was a short one, but with a big idea that will whet your appetite, right, for a bigger legal discussion that we will go into not next week. I almost forgot to tell you. Next week, no class on Wednesday. It's one of the few days that my kids get off and I get off. So I take the Wednesday before Thanksgiving off so that we can do family stuff together. So next Wednesday, no class. But the following week, we will get back in and we're going to be hitting more of this theoretical legal discussion. Once we get through those Mishnayot, we'll get back into some practical, real case examples. Question? Or are you just nodding?
No.
Okay. Yerach, I think you're up.
Mishnah 4:1. And why do they record the opinions of Shammai and Hillel for now?
For not. Levatala, right? It's like, wait a minute, says the little kid at the back of the room, says, Rabbi, why did you teach us for the last 3 Mishnayot? Hillel says this, and Shammai says this, but the sages say that. Just tell us, but the sages. We don't need to hear that Hillel was wrong, and Shammai was wrong, and Hillel was wrong, and Shammai. Tell me the right answer. Don't tell me the wrong answers. It's kind of a reasonable question, isn't it? And the Mishnah is very self-aware, and it asks itself that same question. Why are we doing this way? Why not just tell the answer? Now, in most of the Mishnah, we don't spend a lot of time on minority opinions. Eiduyot, we do. And that's one of the reasons why it's considered to be one of the oldest sections. But when we get to the Talmud, you will spend all your time on minority opinions that get beaten during the fight. And this is a good answer for that as well, and a good answer for why they're included in other Jewish law books. So this is a good place to start. There's more than one answer to this question, by the way, but this is a start to it. So, Yerach, if you could give us the first answer of why we would do this.
Teach the following generations that a man should not always persist in his opinion. For behold, the fathers of the world did not persist in their opinion.
And I love the phrase fathers of the world, right? Hillel and Shammai are like the fathers of the world, at least the fathers of our world, the Jewish world. And when they were shown that they had made an error, they said, oh, okay, then I need to fix that. I need to change what I'm teaching. Think of the humility, right? And specifically, it comes right after the story of the two weavers from the dung gate, right? They show up, they've got a more reliable tradition than Hillel or Shammai, and Hillel and Shammai didn't say, get out of the Beit Midrash, right? Be gone, you smelly peasants, right? They said, you know what? They make a good point. Their memory seems more reliable than ours. Let me just change my notes. Boom. They were willing to accept it, right? That no matter how great you think you are, if someone is able to show you that you're wrong, you should thank them rather than persisting in your error. You should be glad when someone fixes a mistake. Right, and you know, for those of you,
fits the Pirkei Avot. Pirkei Avot, they say.
Exactly right, exactly right.
The Chacham is someone who can admit his mistake
and can learn from everyone.
From everyone.
Exactly. And if those of you who have ever tried to be a teacher, you should know that when you put the red mark on your students' tests, right, or if you've ever had a red mark on your test, that should be something where you get to say, at least now I know what's right and I won't make that mistake again, right? It's meant to be a step to help you move up. We don't always take criticism or correction like that. A lot of us still get very angry when someone points out a mistake that we made. If Hillel and Shammai are willing to accept correction, the rest of us should as well, right? They were right about everything but three things, and they were willing to still accept correction on those three things. Those of us who are wrong about most things should be willing to accept correction on the things that we're able to be corrected on. And you know, I'm going to leave you there with that for our final message from the Mishnah for tonight. But we will continue this topic of why are we teaching these other opinions and all these minority opinions too when we resume in 2 weeks' time. So have a good Thanksgiving next week, and see you all later.